Hi there, Satin class. I'm going to read the next chapter of Mr. Penguin and the Lost Treasure. If you're lucky, I might read 2 chapters. Okay, so it's by Alex T. Smith, Mr. Penguin and the Lost Treasure. There he is with his magnifying glass and his satchel. And we know that inside his satchel are his fish finger sandwiches, because he can't go anywhere without his lunch. And he looks very much like the adventurer that he wants to be. And there's his friend Colin. Colin the spider. And there is his monobrow. Big bushy monobrow. He looks grumpy, but he's a good friend to Mr. Penguin. So here we go. Chapter 4. Closed until further notice. The Museum of Extraordinary Objects was a large and dusty building, with lots of tall columns and twirly bits of stonework. It sat on the corner of West 28th Street and near the Park Avenue, and looked, when viewed from one of the surrounding skyscrapers, like a dinosaur. Mr. Penguin and Colin hoofed it down the road as fast as they could in the rain, weaving in and out of people, hopping around puddles and being terribly busy and important. Eventually, Mr. Penguin and Colin rounded a corner and were just making a dash for the gigantic wrought-iron museum gates when they crashed smack bang into an elderly woman buying a newspaper and some birdseed. "Well, if it isn't Mr. Penguin!" cried the woman. She helped Mr. Penguin up and carefully popped Colin's bowler hat back on his head. It was their good friend, Edith Hedge, who lived in the park and fed the birds. Often Mr. Penguin and Colin would go and share their lunch with her. Edith was, as always, wearing about 15 different anoraks, one on top of the other, belted at the waist with a large bum bag. Sitting on top of her head was a pigeon. He was called Gordon. "And where are my 2 friends going in such a hurry?" she cried, tossing some birdseed up to Gordon, who caught it expertly with his beak. Mr. Penguin puffed out his chest proudly. "We are off to the museum for our first proper adventuring job. We have to find some buried treasure." "Oh dear," said Edith. "I think you might be out of luck. The museum's been closed since yesterday. I've lived in Cityville all my life, and I've never known it to be closed except on Christmas Day. But look, it's shut up tight." She pointed to the enormous front doors of the museum. A large sign said, "Closed until further notice." "It's very strange if you ask me," continued Edith, fussing with her bum bag. "I've known Miss Bones since she was a baby, and she wouldn't close the place unless it was for something very serious indeed." Mr. Penguin was a bit confused. He looked down at Colin, who shrugged as many of his shoulders as he could manage without falling over. This was most odd. Why would Miss Bones call him to the museum if it was closed? "Oh, I know what must be going on," he cried, with a flash of inspiration. "I bet Miss Bones and her brother closed the museum to look for treasure without lots of people getting in the way. That's got to be it." Edith's face creased up into a smile. It was like looking at a friendly, crinkled paper bag. "Well, there we are," she said. "That must be what's happening. You are clever, Mr. Penguin. Now, promise you'll come and find me as soon as you can to tell me all about this treasure." "Of course," said Mr. Penguin. "But now we must go. We're running a bit late." He straightened his hat, tweaked his bow tie, and started off towards the front doors of the museum, with Colin scampering madly behind him. "Good luck!" cried Edith, waving her newspaper at them. Gordon ruffled his feathers encouragingly. The 2 of them headed back into the park as Mr. Penguin and Colin clambered up the steps of the museum. "Oh, go on then. I'll read another chapter." Chapter 5. In a Dreadful State. The gigantic doors of the museum were flung open before Mr. Penguin could even knock the knocker or ring the bell. He and Colin were ushered into the entrance hall by a terribly efficient woman, who shut the doors tight again, locked them, and flung the large iron key into her handbag with a nervous, wobbly hand. Only then did she turn round and Mr. Penguin and Colin got their first look at Miss Boudica Bones. She was a woman of a certain age, and was nearly as wide as she was tall. In fact, She was much like a beach ball on legs, one wearing a neat little pair of court shoes and a pussy bow blouse in powdered shrimp. She was obviously in a terrible flap, but her big red lips broke into a wide, relieved smile when she'd finished fiddling with the clasp on her handbag. "Mr. Penguin! My knight in shining armour!" she cried, as she led them out of the shadows and into the atrium with its domed glass ceiling. "Thank goodness you're here! Just look at the state of the place. I mean, just look! It's falling apart at the seams!" Mr. Penguin and Colin stopped and looked around them. Miss Bones was right. The museum was in a dreadful state. Great chunks of plaster had crumbled off the walls. Framed pictures and notices had fallen off their hooks, and everything, including the gigantic dinosaur skeleton in the centre of the room, was covered in a layer of dust so thick it looked like it had been snowing indoors. It had been years since Mr. Penguin had last visited the museum, and he remembered it as warm and sunny and full of people. But now, without any visitors, and with mess everywhere, it was silent and shadowy, and ever so slightly spooky. "What on earth happened?" gasped Mr. Penguin. "Age, I'm afraid," said Miss Bones sadly. "The museum is well over 200 years old, you see. And when one thing goes, everything else simply follows. It started with some tiles slipping off the roof, and now all this." Great big tears bubbled up behind her spectacles, and she fished down the front of her blouse for a lace-edged hanky. She dabbed at her eyes before blowing her nose loudly in it. It sounded like a foghorn. "What my dear relatives would say if they could see it like this, I don't know. They'd be so disappointed in me," she sighed. Just then, the biggest man Mr. Penguin and Colin had ever seen came out of an upstairs room. He made his way down the staircase that wound round the atrium like a snail shell. He must have been at least 7 foot tall, and was squeezed into pinstripe slacks and a tie that looked like it was attempting to strangle him. There he is. There's his slacks, trousers, and a tie, and he's far too big. Let's find out who he is. He placed a hand the size of a frying pan on Miss Bones' shoulder and patted it gently. "This is my brother, Montague," croaked Miss Bones in a husky voice. "We're both so glad you came to help us. Finding the lost treasure my great-great-great-grandpapa buried really is our last hope of fixing all this damage to the museum and bringing it back to its former glory. Without it, I'm afraid we'll be finished." "You're not the only ones," thought Mr. Penguin grimly. His mind wandered to the bills piling up back at his igloo and the damp, draughty boat he'd be stuck on for weeks on the long journey back to the frozen south. He shook the thoughts from his head and stuck out his chest again. "Don't you worry," he said. "We'll sort all this out. We'll find the treasure for you." He flashed his best smile. Colin wasn't quite so confident, but he smiled anyway. "I certainly hope so," said Miss Bones, stashing away her hanky. "Now let me show you the clues we've found already." She led them upstairs. Mr. Penguin waddled alongside her, bursting with excitement. A real treasure hunt! With clues! This was brilliant. Colin followed behind, frowning to himself. Something about this empty museum was making him feel a bit goose-pimply. It was as if they were being watched. So there we go. I wonder if Colin is right. What do we think? Do we think they're being watched? Mr. Penguin certainly doesn't seem to mind. He's very excited about it all. Let's find out another time.